So this idea of audience-centric development, why is it so important? Let's just remind ourselves why. We've shifted from this model of scarcity to one of abundance, so there's more and more content, more formats, more platforms, more ways to tell stories than ever before, and it increases every year. But that's not the reason to make transmedia or multi-platform projects. We shouldn't just think because the platforms are there, we should use all of these platforms. We have to think very carefully why. And so, along with this idea of abundance of content is this highly active audience, which Brinkley was talking about, Sebastian was talking about yesterday in his presentation. And this is an incredibly valuable asset that we could bring into our projects, because these audiences are media publishers in their own right, happy to take on the role of co-creators, producers, financiers, distributors, curators, and advocates. And this idea of advocacy, I think, is probably the most powerful idea. So this all means that the price of content's dropped, but the value of people's attention has risen greatly. And this attention is of great value to us. And how do we nurture it properly? So this idea of attention has to sit right at the heart of your project development process and business plan. It's not something that should be bolted on at the end. And the thing I found really frustrating about working in independent film was that you were always leaving it to the last minute and it was always too late. So at our lab, we always have this approach, this audience-centric approach. And instead of thinking platform first, instead of getting really, I know it's really kind of exciting working on new formats and platforms, and VR is an example at the moment. I'm seeing a lot of projects that people are sort of like blindly going into developing because they feel they should. So I think it's really important to go back to some sort of like core things and themes about your project. And this is kind of like following on from what Sebastian was saying about Bonce yesterday, is this idea about going back to the core theme that drives your project. Thinking very carefully about what kind of experience you would like to create, and then understanding the motivations and behaviours of the people that you're trying to, that you're communicating with. And then think about where and how you're going to engage them, and how what platform you're going to start on, how that idea could grow. So it's idea first, audience second, platform third. But most of the time, media is developed in a closed business-to-business system where you start with a predetermined film or television property or whatever platform or distribution format, and then you go through this long process of development that's in a vacuum, away from the consumer or user audience, where you're scripting, you're casting, you're financing. In the film industry where I was working, obviously it was, you'll take something to market once it's finished. And all for that process of trying to sell, the audience is just not involved. And there's been no user testing, there's been no R&D, there's been absolutely no contact with the end consumer. And it's not until you get to that point of sale that anyone tries to start thinking about audiences. When I was working in the film business, I used to work with an American company called the Independent Film Channel. And we were working with first and second time feature filmmakers, very talented filmmakers like Christopher Nolan's first film, Following, Joe Carnahan's first film, Blood, Guts, Bullets and Octane. And I found it incredibly frustrating, the amount of time it would take to get a film out. And often our films, even though they were very, very successful in festivals and won prizes at Sundance and Berlin and other festivals, hardly anyone ever saw them in the end. And it was because of this ridiculous process that if we were lucky, 5 years was actually a short time between concept development and point of sale. And that's a huge amount of time when you're working on an idea or a product to be completely in a vacuum. And there's no other business that would allow that to happen. Where someone invests huge amounts of money in something where it hasn't been tested. And the only kind of idea of consumer is sales forecast figures, which are completely fictitious and often have no relevance to the actual product. So, and what I've seen often in the kind of multi-platform and interactive world is that this same process happens, that people are working in a vacuum and they're not doing some of the concepts that has been talked about, that Brinkley was talking about, or Sebastian was talking about as they were developing their brands and projects. And I think this is why it's really super important to start thinking really early on, because a lot of those projects that have been commissioned often fail because they haven't been prototyped, they haven't been tried out. And a lot of the time, over the 10 years I've been around, there's been a lot of criticism around the transmedia or multi-platform world. But I think it's very hard with the processes, because the commissioning and financing almost mirrors the same way that film and television's been financed, which is in a vacuum, where people hand money to people and hope they're going to go away and solve a problem that's very complicated and new. So